Teacher of a primary school in Oxford in England, and I'm also the director of a company called Assess Progress, which I set up. I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but I set up last year to offer comparative judgment. Just very quickly as a show of hands, I've got a terrible cold, by the way, so I'll eat a sweet. You're fine if you eat sweets as well. Just a quick show of hands, who's from Sweden? Nearly everybody. Who's from England? Anyone from England? A few. And you're from Belgium, Marie, because you said some before. Okay. Right. And just a very quick show of hands. Who's an absolute novice with comparative judgment? A few. And other people? It's sort of intermediate. Okay. I'll go from the start all the way through. I imagine you're here though because you think that possibly there's a better way to assess writing. I don't know a lot about writing in Sweden, but you'll use the information to put that in the context of your schools. Just a very quick show of hands then. Who's very happy with the sort of validity of the writing that you do, or the assessment of writing that you do in Sweden? Everybody makes the same judgment all the time. Sometimes you're probably very happy in your school about the validity. Yes, of course, it's absolutely right, but maybe not of other schools. Just a quick show of hands to show then if you think there's any bias in the assessment of writing or the assessment of everything. We could be talking about geography or history or arts or DT. No, so I imagine everyone thinks that there are some biases as well. Okay. The reason why I'm here today, and the reason why I'm here to talk about adaptive comparative judgment, is last year I was here, not that long ago actually, it was about 9 months ago, and it was my first researchED conference, and I came because I just had the government come and assess my school, and I needed a bit of downtime. So I thought, I'll go to Sweden because no one's going to get in contact with me there, and I'll go to their researchED conference. And I came and there was about 3 people talking about comparative judgment, and that inspired me to think about how we were doing assessment in our school, and about the validity of that, and about how we get around the biases. And one of the reasons for that is in traditional moderation of writing in England, what we used to do as a school is we would have 9 other primary schools. My school's got about 500 children aged 3 to 12. And there's 9 other schools like that within about 3 miles radius of my school. And we would get everybody to come to my school, or our school, should say, and they would all bring some work. Now, the work was usually carefully selected by that teacher. It'd usually been assessed beforehand, so that those teachers that brought it knew exactly of what standard it was and what standard they wanted to get out of it. And we would all sit round in the classroom, and we would then share all our pieces of work, and that would be assessed against standard rubric or framework. And then we would get the teachers to fill out a form which says, I think this work is at this standard because, and then all that would get collated and we give that back to the schools. One of the great things about traditional moderation is that it enhances the professional dialogue that all the teachers are having. And that was always a great thing. So we wanted to maintain that with whatever we did, but we wanted to look for something different. Because what we found was nobody ever agreed with each other's judgments. And not only between the schools, so if you're school A and I'm school F, we wouldn't agree between that, but also sometimes within the school. And still happens now, if I have 2 teachers, one teacher's in year 2, so they're teaching sort of 5, 6-year-olds, and a teacher teaching 10, 11-year-olds, they won't agree on what the standard of a 7-year or year 4 or a 7-year-old will look like. And sometimes not even within the year group. So if I've got one teacher teaching year 4 and another teacher teaching year 4, they won't even agree on what that looks like. And that's because we're entirely reliant on what the descriptor says. Okay, and there's a lot more we'll go into in a minute about descriptors and why we are trying in our school to move away from those. The other thing is that there's inherent bias in knowing the children, and that's when the teachers come with their work. So what would happen is they'd go away, everyone would have a professional discussion, they'd take their pieces of paper that say, we think this child is working at this level, this is the outcome of the child. They'd take it away to their school, screw it up, put it in the bin, and give them the grade that they'd originally come to you with. So There's some bias in that. Right, I was inspired before by what Paul said. I'm going to try and explain comparative judgment, but using bananas. It was the lady that I took 5 bananas from was a bit worried why I was taking so many bananas. So if we think about a standard assessment, so we're looking for the outcome of this, is how much does this banana weigh? You can put your hands up. And what we'll do is the criteria that we'll set is you've got to do that in grams or kilograms, I don't mind. Grams or kilograms. Who's going to be really brave and say?
The weight? Are you asking?
The weight, sorry, yeah, the weight of this banana in grams or kilograms? 250 grams. Okay, 100. It's like an auction. You can just shout out. You can just shout out. 100, 250.
75.
75. 110. 120. We're all thinking different things, aren't we? We can see we're all thinking different things. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make an absolute judgment on what the weight of the banana is. And we know the criteria, because that's in grams or kilograms. We know that, and we know what sugar might weigh or what a loaf of bread might weigh. But we haven't got anything else to compare about. Now, what comparative judgment tries to do is it avoids that. And it avoids that by saying, I'm just going to reach into my magic bag. Not that one. I'm feeling for bananas under here. And if you didn't know it was banana and you just put your hand under here and you pull that out, you might be a bit surprised. But what comparative judgment tries to do then is it literally just says, which one would be heaviest? Just point to a side so that I know, point to a side. Of course, we would all say this. So before we were very unreliable because everybody had a different idea of what that might weigh, but now we're very reliable because everybody all would point this way. Unless someone said that's made out of metal and that's made out of paper, they're not, they're all banana. This one is the heaviest, okay? So that's what comparative judgment, all it asks you to do is say which one is, in this case, heavier. That one we all know, okay? Now again, which one now is heavier? This one, yeah? It was heaviest before, it was there. Now it's heavier in this one. Now what adaptive comparative judgment does is after a while, it works out that this one's always winning. And so we know that that one's always going to win. Yeah? So it ignores that one for a little bit. And what it does is it tries to put one through where there's a bit of ambiguity. We're not quite sure on which one now. So in comparative judgment, you'll get ones that are like this. Yeah, where it's obvious. Sometimes obvious. What adaptive comparative judgment tries to do is it takes ones that maybe some people say it's that one, and it gives it to more people. So which one now would you say? Yeah. Most people saying that one, but a few people unsure. If I just put them next to each other, you're probably right. They're about the same size and shape, but it's more difficult and a bit slower to make that judgment. Okay, so that's what we're talking. If anyone wants a banana, there's loads there, but at the end. So we're making these comparative judgments. And it reduces the reliance on the descriptors, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. This is a standard piece of work. This could be your history, your geography, could be anything. It's very difficult to see, but this is a standard piece of work in Year 6. Okay, so your teacher in Year 6, or in whatever you want to moderate, gets this sort of work. And in England, they've got to make lots of judgments. Got to make lots of judgments about this piece of work, and the next one that comes up, and the next one, and the next one. And this is the rubric that they have to use. So this is if it's working towards the standard. So in England there's working towards the standard, working at the standard, or working beyond the standard. And these are reasonably simple to understand. So for instance, in non-narrative writing, so not stories, use simple devices like headings, subheadings and bullet points. It'd be reasonably easy for children to understand that and therefore apply that to their work, or at least as a teacher to be able to tell the children that that's what you're looking for. And then use of full capital letters, full stops and question marks, commas, so there's a lot of sort of punctuation around that, but mostly correctly is a bit ambiguous. Does that mean 9 times out of 10? Or 6 out of 10? Or does it mean 51 out of 100 times? These are the difficulties that we have when we look into standard moderation. And sometimes what happens with the rubrics or with the frameworks is you get things like this. Spell correct words in Year 3-4 spelling list. So you get sometimes children trying to shoehorn words in from a spelling list into their writing. This might not make any sense in Sweden, but it goes down a storm in England, the next bit I'm going to say. About 10 years ago, I was working in Year 4 in a place in the north of England where it used to have a coal mine. So we'd take coal out of the ground, and they're usually largely poor areas, a lot of deprivation. And one of the words was pharaoh. Does pharaoh make sense in Swedish? So that one of the words was pharaoh that they had to use. But we were writing about coal miners in the north of England in the 1980s. And in order to get the word pharaoh in, the children were naming the pub that the miners went to at the end of their shift, the Pharaoh's Tomb, to show that they could spell the word pharaoh. Fortunately, it doesn't happen all that much now, but it just goes to show if you're trying to tick boxes all the time, that it's very easy to get round some of the boxes that you have to tick, but it makes no sense at all. Okay, makes no sense. So this is working towards the expected standard. This is by the time the children are 11. Then if they're working at expected standard, so this is what England expects all children age 11 to be able to do by the end of year 6, by the time they're 11, before they go into secondary school. Some of it again is write effectively for a large range of purposes and audiences, selecting language that shows a good awareness of the reader, whatever that means. And you've got to argue this at the end of the year with a moderator that will come from your local authority to say, show me that. And so they have this. It's even more difficult for the children to understand. So even if you've shared that with the children, some of the children might get this because they might be wide readers and they might understand how to write that from the point of view of a writer to the reader. In my school, 50% of the children come to our school speak English as an additional language. We've got 43 different languages in school. Some of the children struggle to speak English, and so instructions like this for their writing very difficult or hard to come by for those children. And they often therefore will not be then assessed as being anywhere near working at the expected standard because they don't necessarily have a good understanding of what that means. An interesting thing also, I'm going to talk a little bit more about a big project that we did with 14 other schools using comparative judgment. One of the things is integrate dialogue into narratives to convey character and advance the action. So just very simply put in some speech marks and have the character talk a little bit to advance the action. What happened though is we did one of the work pieces that we asked 413 children to do was a narrative and plenty of opportunity for dialogue, but only 3 children of the 413, when we took away all of the criteria, actually wrote any dialogue, and all 3 of them were down at the sort of weaker end of the order that I'll show you in a minute. So it doesn't always, just because we teach to this and we're trying to get children to do this, when you ask them naturally to write under their own steam and you take away the criteria, you don't necessarily do this. So the children also are just ticking boxes in their heads. Okay. But teachers have got to assess all this, so there's loads of assessment has to be done on each piece of work. And because up here, write effectively for a range of purposes and audiences, it's not just one piece of work they're assessed on, multiple pieces of work. So it should have a portfolio of about 6 or 8 pieces of work from each child, but obviously they'll do more than that in the school. Oh, I pressed the wrong button, so. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. We're all sort of there. Okay, and then again, for this, there's similarities in Sweden, I know. Children working beyond that, they have another range of criteria or assessment, which is even more ambiguous. But teachers will try to argue this. This bit is reasonably easy to understand, but then choose the appropriate register. Well, a register for a child is when you mark their name in the book in the morning. So it's very difficult for them even to understand the language when this has been designed. Okay. So now we know all of that. All of that criteria is what teachers in England and probably teachers in Sweden have to do for each piece of work. So we've got all of that against that piece of work that's on their board there. Okay. Currently, the huge craze with teachers of children who are 11 years old is to put semicolons in writing all over the place. And most of the teachers of the 11-year-olds aren't quite sure when to use a semicolon. And if you Google it, which obviously everybody does, to go, when should I use a semicolon? The amount of different varieties of where, apart from writing in a list, the amount of other reasons where people should be writing using semicolons is huge. But what it does lead to is loads of kids, 11-year-olds, writing work or writing in whatever they're doing, geography, history, whatever it is, putting semicolons all over the place. So punctuation has improved, but only because we're giving them the criteria. Another coincidental thing is in the project that I'll talk about, the 413 children, only 3 children again used a semicolon in any of the writing because we hadn't told them to do that. We just said write based on this stimulus, and that's what happened. So some of the writing was fantastic. I'm not saying it was any weaker for the fact it didn't have a semicolon in. I'm just making the point that children don't readily write with, adults don't readily write with semicolons in. And there was the writing was really good, high quality writing. As a reader, sort of emotional when it gets into characterization and things like that, and you can say there's a fantastic piece of work. But if you were to assess it as the government would want us to assess it in the old traditional way of moderating, because it didn't have this, it wouldn't meet the required standard. Or it might also be very good. It also, what happens is by the time those children get to year 7, which is their first year in secondary school for us, all of the secondary school teachers say to all of the primary school teachers, what did you teach them in writing? None of these children can write. Because they're writing splatter in their work with loads of semicolons and dashes and all over the place. And they forget the emotional side of trying to convey a message or a meaning or writing the narrative for a story. So I was talking to someone before, I don't know if this is, I was talking to someone before about, she was a university lecturer in Sweden, and they have the same problem with coming down from secondary school up to university standard because it's academic writing and children aren't necessarily taught that. They're taught the sort of procedural writing is what I would say. Children just following the procedures of how to write without being able to convey a message appropriately. And living in Oxford, with Oxford University, I've got a lot of friends who are lecturers there and they say the same thing. Regardless of where the children have come from or how many A's they've got at A-level, and you'd have to get a lot of A's at A-level to go to Oxford University, all of the lecturers say, these children can't write anything because they're not taught necessarily to write in an appropriate way for their audiences. Okay. This is the workload. There was a big directive in England last year about workload of teachers because the fallout rate of teachers is huge in England. So about 30% of all teachers leave the profession after less than 5 years of newly trained, and there's a real big issue with retaining teachers in England. So the government paid a couple of £1 million for a big project to be run about workload, and schools have adapted that in lots of different ways. One of the things about workload, though, is the policy, the framework of moderation and assessment, particularly in writing, and particularly in year 6. This doesn't. It happens in year 2 when the children are about 5, 6, but it doesn't happen anywhere else in schools. For those teachers, is huge. So if you're then making 500 judgments per class, and then you multiply that by the 8 or 9 pieces of work, it's a couple of thousand judgments that need to be made across a portfolio of work that the children have done. Okay, and then the last thing, the other benefit. So we've done away with that with comparative judgment. That's the point of showing you that. Comparative judgment does away with all of that. The other thing it does away with is it reduces the bias. So you all said, probably in your school or in other schools that you know, but we're not going to mention, there's a little bit of bias in how we go about assessing whatever subject it is that you take. Or Marie would say competencies. That's probably a better word to use with most students. The competencies of the child. So there's the halo effect, which is because you know the child, you're slightly biased in their favour usually. If they have, for instance, so in my school this might be teachers saying, child's got special educational needs, normally really struggles, but has done a fantastic piece of work. They put in loads more effort than they usually would. Still not a very good standard. It's better than their previous standard, but I'm going to inflate the grade because of the effort that they put in, because I know that child and I know the struggle. Likewise, a child that would usually score a really high grade doesn't do as well, not as engaged in the whole process, but because they would usually do a fantastic piece of work, what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to inflate their grade to say, actually, they can usually write to that standard, so I'm going to say, although if I compare it against others, I'm going to suggest that it's slightly better than it is. And then the other one is the order effect, which is, as a teacher goes home, has to do moderation. You're marking all your books, and usually as a teacher, and this is what I would do, you would either choose the ones that you know or think you know are going to be really good first, get them out of the way, because they're going to be really easy, and then you'll do the rest. Or you'll choose the ones of the children with the special educational needs, because it will take you slightly longer to do them, and you want to pay particular attention to the feedback. But what happens is you're making these comparative judgments all the time. So you're only comparing the next piece of work that you marked to the one that you marked earlier. So if you mark a really good piece of work, or an average piece of work, and the next one isn't as good, you'll deflate the grade, possibly, with the order effect. Or likewise, if you've marked a not very good one and it's slightly better, you might then give it an inflated grade, because you're only using comparison. So you're using comparative judgment all the time. You're just not using it in the same way. Okay. That all makes sense so far. That's about moderation and about where we're at and how comparative judgment works. So it's highly reliable, so it can be replicated a lot of times. If we went into that room over there with the bananas, they would say the same as you. Yeah, so it puts our reliability really high. Whereas if we gave you all descriptors in a book, you probably would all say, most of you would say the same thing, but some of you would say something different. And that causes an issue then when we come to looking at assessment. The next thing for adaptive comparative judgment is what we wanted to keep from the traditional moderation, because moderation has been fine. There are some things that work really well. One of it is the fact that teachers get to sit down and talk about what work looks like across a range of schools that they possibly don't work in. So you're sat in a school A, and you've got loads of work, you say, oh, this is the best piece of work in my school, so this is going to score really highly. But when you take it to the next school down there, it actually doesn't perform that well, because they're performing at a completely different rate. Don't get to see that in a school, so you're quite isolated. But with comparative judgment, or the way that this works, you get to see a whole range of writing from across a whole range or a band of schools. So we did this one, I'm going to explain, with 14 different schools. So each school got to see the very best of all of the writing, and some of the weaker writing, and you can make some inferences yourself about that as well. The thing that I'll come on to at the end is the feedback for the staff, for the teachers, that informs their planning and how we go about doing that. Because that's a difficult thing with comparative judgment, and it's one of the arguments against it. I will argue against it as well, by the way, comparative judgment, as we go through. One of the arguments against it is that how do you readily get that feedback back to the kids? Yeah, and there's a couple of ways that we can do it. I'll talk about that as well. And then the last way is, we've talked about bias and how that is in traditional moderation, but the other bit is about how tired you are. So if you're moderating 500 judgments on all that pieces of work, time you start the first one on Monday night, watching the television with your chips and your egg and your ham on your legs and eating and having a look at your books, you feel quite fresh, but by a Friday afternoon, when you're exhausted and you just want the weekend to come, you're sort of more fatigued, and your judgment will suffer because of that. Now, because you're only ever judging those two pieces, if you're really bright and fresh for these two pieces, that's great, but all you're doing is judging those two pieces. By the Friday afternoon, if you're still judging, you might be exhausted, but you're still only judging those two pieces. So the fatigue that you feel doesn't have any effect on whether you say yes or no. That's about your professional judgment, and it gives that professionality back to the teachers. So, this is how the system works. You may have seen something similar. DPAC do something like this, more or less. No More Marking do something more or less like this. And there's one from British Columbia University in Canada, which is open source, so you can go and get the code and rewrite your own stuff if you wish. There you go. How fair is that? They're the only four I know. So this is what it looks like to the teachers. So you upload your work. This is what the teacher gets when they sign on. They have to log in, so you know who the judge is, and we give them all their bits of work. And then all we're asking them to do is judge which of these is the better bit of writing. So we call it a holistic statement. We're not necessarily saying who's got the best punctuation, who's got the best vocabulary, although we could say that, and you could do whatever you want with it, but you just got to be careful when you're choosing the statement by which you want everybody to assess by, and that everybody knows that. Okay, and at the start of this project, we did half an hour's training with all of the teachers that were involved in the project, which was quite time-consuming. And so one of the other issues with comparative judgment is quite time-consuming in that way. However, we've moved on from this project. We now do a 2.5-minute YouTube video, and our reliability results are the same. So it's not an onerous thing. You don't need loads of training in this. Whereas with moderation, you do need, if you want to get the reliability very high, you do need lots of training, you do need lots of people to come to you, and you do need to have that and share that professional discussion, so there's sort of wins there. Okay, so you get that. You can zoom in if you're hard of sight. Some of the older teachers like that. I'm only joking. And they go, oh, you can zoom in. So you can take it down to 1, you can switch them around, you can zoom in. So it doesn't matter how small the child's writing is, you can still see it. Okay, now, this is that you only really need to you can make 2 decisions. One is just to say, which one do you prefer, A or B? And you just click on the A or the B. That's fine. This thing here tells you what the question was. So at the start, the person responsible has to set the question. We have just in this one said, which is the best writing? Use your professional decision of everything that you know, bearing in mind we know that everyone will know something slightly different, to choose which one you think is the best. And then you just click A or B. Now, again, once you've done that, you can't get any feedback back to the child. And that's where moderation you can, because you can be making notes and writing it down. So what we put into the system is that you can leave feedback for the child. So you click on the little speech thing, and then any of the judges can say, I liked A because the characterization of the da-da-da-da-da, or the dialogue that you used really took the thing forward. Okay? And then that goes back into a little file for the child, so that can be printed off, and then you can vet that a little bit and use that. Right, so the whole process. You complete a task that we send out, or we sent out in this case, sent out a task which was a stimulus based on a video that's on YouTube that we knew everybody could download. And what we were trying to go for was low threshold, high ceiling, so that everybody could have access. So in our school, there was 50% of this group that did this in our school. 50% of the children lived in poverty, and 50%, which was some of those children and some others, had English as additional language. And we knew similar for other similar schools. So we wanted to make it accessible to everybody. So we showed a stimulus, which was a short narrative, was about 5 minutes long, had no words. It was a cartoon called The Dreamcatcher, which is also on literacyShed.com, which is great for loads of different stimuluses, or stimuli, or something. Someone will tell me, correct me. And then we said, watch this. Now you could either do a recount of that, if you didn't have the sort of creative capacity to think of something different, or you can use that as a stimulus to write your own story based on a dream catcher. And about half did a recount of the story, and half did something else. So everybody had a piece of writing. And it was low, so it was low effort for them in terms of that, but how they wrote it. There wasn't any tears. It was very low risk for everybody. It wasn't, here is your end of year exam, complete this, and if you don't do very well, we'll confine you to the rubbish bin, etc., etc. So that happens in week 1. You just upload it all, scan it all in on a computer or on a photocopier up to the system, and then the judging starts for 5 days. And then you get your report back the week after. So the whole process takes about 10 days. Right, here's all the numbers. For each piece of writing, 20 separate judgments are made by 20 different teachers. And this system, or the systems do it slightly differently, this system is 20 teachers from not in your school. So we reduce the bias down again. So nobody will know the person that they're reading the writing off. Does that make any sense? So we try and take out all that bias. But 20 different professional judgments give us our consensus, the professional consensus, for each piece of writing. Judgment time took approximately 90 seconds. It's much higher than, for instance, no more marking. for a number of different reasons. One of them is that I think the adaptive state of the one that we used, because it often puts ones next to each other that it wants to sort of fine-tune, is the best way I can describe it. So if you've got one that's 1-3 and one that's 1-3, it'll put those two together for the next person. Okay. We're trying to reduce this by doing what's called chaining. So it'll only give you a new one. So you've read one, it'll only give you one new one. Okay. But it does take about 1 minute 30 seconds. You get quicker as you use it. And 90% of each school's writing is judged by people from outside the school. And it's cloud-based, so you can use it anywhere. So we could do a project, for instance, with a Swedish school and an English school. We don't need to meet up. You watch 2.5 minutes on a video, and then you'll get, if we were to do writing on this, you'll understand how your level of English writing would match the writing of an English school, for instance. Might be quite useful for you to understand that, without then saying that, you know, lots of different things. So this is how it works. These are all the different schools. Excuse me. So this is representative of all the schools. There are 14 in our trial. And this is what the report looks like, the sort of back office bit. We try to make it as simple as possible. These are all the bits of writing that have been uploaded. And this is all the sort of noise level, so they haven't been assessed yet. So the computer sort of does this. All the computer does is put these into a sort of order. Doesn't tell us the quality of it, doesn't tell us anything else. Just puts it into an order. It still relies on our professional opinion as to how good that piece of work is. But that's all this does. So all the teachers are then pinged all of this work, and it was Eva actually that we got, rather than rank order, because some schools are really against the idea that you would rank order children, and we definitely don't tell the children where they are ranked in their order, but we say it's a collective professional consensus, because 20 other people have decided. What it also does, which is a sort of incidental thing, is that if you ever get any complaints from parents to say, oh, my child's writing this, isn't it? You can say, well, 20 other people have assessed this. It's not down to that teacher. The whole of the judgment isn't focused solely on that person. Okay. So you can see by round 5 we're already at 0.7 for reliability. 1 would be everybody agreed with every judgment that was made and put up in front of them. And round 5 means that every piece of writing has been seen 5 times already, but it's going to be seen 20 times. So we have 20 rounds in total. What's interesting about this is the one with the big tails here, that's one that people don't necessarily agree with. More people disagree with that. There's one there as well. There's one there as well. And what we find with, and also find with comparative judgment, is that at either end, you'll also get big tails early on. And that's because there's not anything to compare it to. So if one always wins up here, you haven't got another one that always wins, because that's the one that always wins initially. But from round 5, the adaptive bit starts to, so this will be how comparative judgment looked, and then the adaptive bit, what it would do is it'd start putting ones in this little group here together to try and fine tune, to say, we'll make a decision, and the computer tries to say, well, okay, well, out of those two there, that one's won twice, so I'm going to bump that one up this way. But this will be the same for No More. You'll get the same sort of report from Deepak or No More Mark, and it looked exactly like that. They're all reasonably similar. And by round 10, reliability has moved up to 0.8, so it just increases the reliability. Now, this is usually already at least as high as the traditional moderation marking. In loads of studies, I've got a big thing of at the back, in loads of studies this is already higher now than if we had it marked against the rubric. And you'll see that all those tails are sort of shortened, but we've still got at the top end there some ones that are reasonably high, and there. Now, some comparative judgment engines stop at round 10 now to reduce the amount of time for judging, because with comparative judgment it can take a lot of time, or you need a lot of judges. Okay, so some stop there because reliability is higher than through standard traditional moderation. And then at the end, reliability has gone up to 0.88. These are all our 413 writers. That's what they look like, and you can click on these down here and that will bring up the picture, so it makes it really clear. That's what it looks like as a sort of pictorial view. So these are the 20 judges. They all looked at that piece of work. They'll all have looked at ones there and there and there as well, but that's the rank order. There's 413. from a school's point of view then, so what? You know, we've done our comparative judgment, but so what?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like,
Now
whatever. So from a school's point of view, this is what you get, and now this is what we do with ours. Okay, so we get this now. So what the system is a bit, we've tried to get the system to do is to break that down then into what's your school. All of these marks here are individual children in that school. I've changed the name, but CFK school, for instance, is there. So we can already make some assumptions about this school from that. So if you were the head teacher, you've got the best child in your school is the best child in this group of 413, which is across Oxfordshire. The majority of the children are in the top 50% actually in Oxfordshire. Okay, on there. And also from that school you would know who each of these children were. So maybe you can then start to look at targeting writing interventions for these children, or at least comparing these to what you have based against traditional marking. So you'll already know from your school where your children sit, and you'll be able to work that. So your schools get this. That then looks like this. Don't draw too much assumption from that. For instance, this is my school. We've got very high numbers of children with English as additional language. This school's a little small village school where everybody's very sort of white, middle to upper class, live in mansions and manor houses, etc. And mine's got high tails there, so I've got some children right at the very top of the whole thing, but I've also got a lot right at the very bottom. So it's important when you get data through that you sort of scrutinise it with that sort of hat on. We can break it down to an academy chain. This was one academy chain who took part in this. That's that school that you saw against the rest of its academy chain. So now I know, if I was the leader in the academy chain, where to target my English interventions, possibly, or where best practice may be happening if I know about these schools in their context. If this is a really challenging school, or challenging cohort school, but it's doing very well, probably got some good practice there. Yeah, if this is in an affluent area, and it has historically done well on traditional moderation, but it's not done very well here, maybe we need to look at that further. I'll quickly whiz through this. This is the full session rank. So Emily V, she was the top one. 107 was Catherine N. This gives it the percentage. You can see most of the children sit above 50% in that school. That's the rank in the school, so you can compare that against what your teacher assessment is, and then that's for your academy chain. You don't have to have an academy chain, but it's just an additional thing we put into that. Okay, well, we interviewed 30 teachers at the end, and they said that one of the main thing they looked for when they were looking at their writing was use of exciting vocabulary, how it made you as the reader feel. Now, none of that is in the traditional moderational framework, but it's funny how all the teachers use that as the way that they interpreted or looked at the writing, for instance. There's just some figures. We had to have 72 judges, nearly 4,000 judgments in total. Right, this is my sort of last bit. So again, so what? What does that mean then back in school? So this is what we do. We're able to send out exemplars. We do that all the way through the order, the professional order. Now, on a lot of the research you'll read about exemplars, it usually suggests that you give the very best exemplars to all of the children, and they use that as the gold standard. But actually, it doesn't work, because if you're the child that sits at 50% or at 70%, you haven't got any idea how that child got to that. You're just sort of setting the bar far too high. So we send it out within some instruction to say, look at 20% above where that child sat, and you've got access to that. So that child then sits there with their essay, and they'll also have the one that was 20% above, and it's closer for them to make some judgments about their own writing from, and they can make a smaller step to move up rather than a huge jump to get to the top. So that's one thing that you can do, and I would say anyway, if you're using exemplars, the government produce lots in England, be wary of which ones you're using and why, and try and scaffold that for each of the children in your class. The other one is then misconception lesson. Once the teachers have all made their judgments, they sit down and write some things out about what all of the children did, any misconceptions that all of the children had. May that be sentence starters, punctuations or short writing. Then they'll do some short writing, but they'll reteach that to everybody. This is a good one, it's goldfish bowl activity. We do this with all our teachers, so all of our teachers mark year 6 writing, year 5, year 4. Then we sit the teachers in the middle of a circle, and all of the judges sit around the outside. So if you're in year 1 and we've just done some comparative judgment on your class, you sit in the middle with a pad and a pen. All the other teachers sit around the outside, you're in the middle in the goldfish bowl. And then they talk about what writing looked like, not just in our school, but in all the schools. And you make as many frantic notes as you can in 10 minutes. And then you turn your chair round and you talk it back to all the teachers to say, this is what I think you understood by year 1 writing. We just call it a goldfish bowl technique. And then they take that back to their class and then reteach that. Yeah? It's a management concept, but we use it in here. We have some children compare 3 or 4 exemplars against theirs, look for things that were good about it, things that weren't as good, so we also do that. And then sometimes we get pupils to do the judging themselves, but that's a different thing altogether. Here's very quickly what some of the teachers said about using it. Mostly it's quick and easy, reduces the burden of assessment, builds up a good accurate picture of assessment. It's quick and easy again, it's reliable. They like the fact they get to see a whole range of work from a whole range of children across a range of everything. Takes away the focus from tick boxes and searching for evidence all the time. Supports CPD in schools, and it's not skewed, all those things that we talked about before. There's a list of references. I'll put this up on our website so you can pick it up. It's assessprogress.com. It'll be in there, or you can just email there and I will get back to you. I am a head teacher of the school and it can be quite busy sometimes, so if it doesn't come back straight away, don't think I've forgotten you. It's just how it is. Okay, thank you.